Well, welcome to some thoughts on legitimacy in public administration. I'm Maurice Bisheff, and I think that legitimacy is a very important topic that we should consider in the field because so many public agencies and public administrators get caught up in conflicts around legitimacy. As an example, most of us in the public sector are urged to be both efficient and effective. And so, for example, the NYPD has been very efficient and effective through stop and frisk and information systems models of reducing crime in New York City. So while efficiency and effectiveness have traditionally been goals in public administration and still are very important expectations the public has of public managers, there's a third factor, legitimacy, now that comes into play. For in fact, if you're stopping and frisking particular areas in the city, and that have particular kinds of populations, pretty soon the people who live there, even though they may be innocent of a crime, once it happens, especially more than once, begin to think they're being profiled or picked on. And in fact, the police are viewed more as an occupying army than as facilitators of preventing crime. So then there's a question of legitimacy. Are the police doing the right thing? They are being efficient, they are being effective, but are they being legitimate? You can take another issue like drones, for example, and how we're going to be using drones domestically as well as internationally. And again, they can be efficient and they can be effective, but the question is, how do we use them in a way that, in fact, are legitimate? So what is legitimacy? It's a concept that isn't necessarily boundary defined. It has a lot of different dimensions to it. And I just want to review some of those dimensions with you and its implications for public administrators. Legitimacy can be defined as the source of political authority in a political system. Where legitimacy comes from usually comes from a founding event, a combination of a charismatic leader, but more than a charismatic leader, a set of founding and instantiating principles that where symbols and laws flow from as a founding event. So for the United States government, obviously the Declaration of Independence is a source of legitimacy. The Constitution is a source of legitimacy as a set of laws, but also as principles of how we're going to dialogue with each other. So the founding event then is very, very important. So for the Chinese Communist Party, Mao Zedong, a charismatic leader, one could say, also instantiated certain principles of both communist philosophy but also Communist Party elite control over the polity. How these things play out, of course, is another story, and why the Chinese, a 5,000-year-old civilization, chose a European propagandist, Karl Marx, to be their source of legitimacy remains to be seen. But legitimacy does have its mysterious aspects to it. Nonetheless, what we view as legitimate is what we view as right. If something's right, it's pretty much legitimate. So we have the situation, however, that we can use legitimacy either as an instrumental or a non-instrumental kind, or both, form to justify our actions. The instrumental form of legitimacy, which Thomas Hobbes articulated in his political philosophy, is simply that you want to legitimize the use of force, or a monopoly of force, a legitimacy of force, on the population. And rather than doing it with standing armies, if you can create legitimacy through the consent of laws backed up by force, then in fact you economize. So the instrumental use of legitimacy is an economizing function that doesn't take that many societal resources to get people to agree to laws and to agree to behave in certain ways, ways that are considered by the regime values as correct. A second source of legitimacy, which isn't mutually exclusive, is sort of a non-instrumental view of legitimacy. This non-instrumental view is really based on the fact that it's contested power, that people have different views of what's right, what's just, and in fact the political system and public agencies that implement programs within that political system and those values, that those values are in fact contested, and that's why we have dialogues, constitutions, and procedures, checks and balances, whether they're written or unwritten norms, as a way of sustaining legitimacy in that sense. With the non-instrumental form of legitimacy, legitimacy is like the stock market. One day you might act in a certain way, as the police might in a particular neighborhood, and everyone will be pleased with them. Their legitimacy, their stock, if you will go up on the stock exchange. But if the police act in arbitrary ways relative to the norms of the community, then the police's legitimacy will go down in the eyes of the community. And legitimacy is associated with a complex of concepts, trust being one that's very important. To the extent to which someone's acting legitimately, you can trust them. The extent to which someone is perceived as acting illegitimately, even though they may be acting efficiently, effectively, and even according to the law, but for some reason not acting justly, they may be viewed as not only non-legitimate, but as someone not very trustworthy. So legitimacy then tends to be somewhat of a slippery concept, but nonetheless, again, it moves beyond efficiency and effectiveness to a third criteria in public administration. However, within legitimacy, you can find that there are two basic forms of legitimacy. One is substantive legitimacy. And in this form, legitimacy is viewed as, does your actions concur with the values of the community that you're serving? So the substantive part of legitimacy is that you're using symbols, actions, purposes, and methods which seem to conform to the values of the community or are consistent with the values of the community. A second form of legitimacy is procedural legitimacy. Not only are you acting in accord with the values of the community, but you're also essentially doing procedural due process of law. You're respecting the law or respecting professional practice by practicing and acting in such a way in accord with accepted norms of procedure and accepted norms of law and accepted norms of process. So public administrators on the firing line, on the ground, so to speak, street-level bureaucrats as sometimes it's called, actually then have to subscribe to both substantive legitimacy as well as procedural legitimacy. Now, many times, if one's a nonprofit organization, one thinks that by being virtuous, one can be legitimate. I mean, there are a lot of organizations, nonprofit, governmental, even businesses, that are actually providing services to people and doing good, handing out humanitarian aid, for example. But that doesn't necessarily mean that just because they're virtuous, they have sufficient credibility, because you can only gain credibility through legitimacy. So if you enter another country or enter a zone that's just had a horrible crisis of some kind, and even though you are seen as virtuous and you're providing aid, if it doesn't fit what's needed, your credibility goes down, and so does your legitimacy. So if people need foodstuffs and you're providing transportation, transportation may be well and good, but may not be what's exactly needed at the time. So we find that the situational legitimacy, both procedural and substantive, then, is very important, getting back to doing the right thing as perceived. And there is an interplay, however, between situational legitimacy, that is your act legitimate in the situation, and a deeper sense of legitimacy, which are founding principles and values that we talked about at the beginning. There is an interplay between both. There are deeper values. It might be liberty, it might be nonviolence, it may be justice, all somewhat interpreted through different cultural lens and historical lens of historical experience, and through different cultures in different ways. But all of which then relate back to a source of what's right and what's good. And that has to be a very important norm that administrators need to think about. Not simply what's required in the immediate situation, but also what's required in the immediate situation that links up to and will revivify, if you will, basic values of human dignity and basic values of the regime and symbols in the regime. Finally, one of the things about legitimacy is that sometimes we don't find out what's legitimate or not until we've actually broken the code of legitimacy. That in a sense we accept the norms as sort of just being as things flow. But in fact, a lot of times we get surprised when all of a sudden someone says, hey, that's not legitimate, or didn't you consider X, and why didn't you? And so a lot of times legitimacy, in a way, can be considered an act of speech, because essentially it's contesting the norm. It's confronting the norm, and that's how you find out, sometimes through hindsight, whether your action is legitimate or not, whether the product you produce in an industry, which seems to prevent cancer or seems to do something good, actually has these side effects that you knew or didn't know about, and then it becomes an issue of the legitimacy of the drug. All of these things then revolve around the notion that one has to not get trapped simply being an instrumental agent for efficiency, effectiveness, profit, getting the numbers right to justify to your boss, performance, this, that, and the other, and ignore the variable of legitimacy. In the end, however, we also need as individuals to have a very strong conscience and awareness when things are off, quote unquote, when things are not right. And we tend to have these feelings. Almost everyone does, but whether these deeper feelings get to the level of the mind and wakefulness, and then even if they do, are they brushed aside because of the pressures of conformity to a certain norm or to a certain profession or to a certain social group, and the threats of being an outsider or an outcast or a whistleblower prevent us a lot of times from, until maybe it's too late, actually challenging and contesting legitimacy. But for those of us in public administration who elect to work in the public sector especially, and for those of you in businesses who do things that have public effects, as most of you actually in the private sector do, it's very important to be a citizen, not simply an agent, an instrumental agent. And as a citizen, to let your conscience tell you what's off, what's right, because you're a member of a larger polity, a larger symbolism, and as part of humanity, you're part of knowing what requires an approach to human dignity and justice that many times in the rush to get numbers, performance, profit, efficiency, effectiveness, satisfy your boss, etc., gets blown by the wayside. Well, public administrators, of course, then have to also consider, in addition to their conscience, they have to be able to operate in a way that creates legitimacy, in the same way you operate creating effectiveness and efficiency. And so there may be at least two different principles for doing this. One is you need to generate value agreement between your agency and the other stakeholders or people that are involved and impacted by what you're doing, what your service is, and how they impact other people. So in that respect, you need to begin to shape some degree of consensus or some degree of common ground, some degree of minimal understanding, at minimum, so to speak, for value agreement. And this becomes very important because so many of our problems in public administration are characterized as wicked problems. They're interconnected with other problems: housing, poverty, homelessness, poor school achievement, poor nutrition. They're all sort of all linked to each other. That's what makes them difficult to get at, because they're wicked. They're interdependent and they're interlinked. And so what we have to, in a turbulent environment, do then is try to create shape, even if it's a temporary alliance, of different groups and different carriers of value in the community: citizens, civil society organizations, other departments of government, elected officials, to try to create some kind of a degree of consensus as to what might be an approach to handle these problems. So this creates a broader authorizing environment, authorizing for the public administrator to act in a different way, and also for resources that the public administrator needs to deploy in order to do something different that might help engage these multi-organizational, multi-sector problems that we have to face. So one, in a sense, in summary, has to create a public value. And this is one of the ways of creating public value. In doing so, then, we have to sort of co-create with citizens. That we're not simply a closed system unto ourselves anymore, sort of the imperious state above the citizens, but rather we have to work with citizens at times as partners, other times as consultants, other times as co-producers of a service. But we have to have this broader engagement with citizens. And that creates in the community a new sense of public value and a new sense of legitimacy. So the public administrator then, through their salary, is not just authorized to implement existing legislation, but also is commissioned to seek out and identify problems and issues regarding their domain of service that can be emerging, that trends they're going to affect, and be able to work with others, not to decide anything, but to co-shape it, co-create it, and work with their expertise and with their facilitation to integrate experts with citizen views so that all different views can begin to be integrated. Doesn't mean there won't be conflict and a lot of contestation, but it does mean that becomes the task of the public administrator who's seeking the public interest. So legitimacy then has to be created sometimes. It can't just simply be assumed by a legal mandate. And the notion of co-creating with citizens in different ways, in different circumstances, with different authorizing environments is a critical aspect for public administration. A good example of this might be the Los Angeles City School District that was sort of pressured externally originally to create nutritious food for their students. This is a very large system. And so many of the administrators said, well, let's work with the citizens. Give us your ideas as to what the menu should be. What should your children be eating? What should you be doing? And so over a period of time, a lot of it through trial and error and through some criticism, as you might imagine, they were able to start to create nutritious menus. Part of the problem, of course, is that the children didn't like it. Or they didn't like some of the exotic foods they were being asked to eat. So then you have suppliers and food safety, et cetera, et cetera. But nonetheless, through working at it over a process, one could start to create a public value and a certain legitimacy for creating a nutritious menu for students. So that means that you have to operate as an administrator in an open systems environment, not a closed systems environment, in order to do that. So all of these are just some operational suggestions as to how the idea of legitimacy has to take its place with efficiency and effectiveness as a criteria for effective performance of public administrators. Thank you very much.